Ancient Egyptian society, religion and myths in particular, were held together by a strong belief in order, referred to as Maat in the ancient Egyptian language. Maat was not just a concept, but also a goddess who represented order and justice, and was often symbolized with an ostrich feather that symbolized truth. It has even been argued that Maat was so important to the ancient Egyptian worldview that the ancient Egyptian concept of religion can be defined as the realization of Maat. Although ancient Egyptian religion was not dualistic in the sense of good versus evil, there was a polar opposite concept of Maat known as Isfet. The concept of Isfet includes sickness, disease, violence, or anything that is the antithesis of order. All aspects of ancient Egyptian religion were concerned with keeping the proper order of the universe, which usually included performing the proper religious rituals. One of the most difficult concepts for modern societies to grasp concerning ancient Egyptian religion was its emphasis on rituals. When reading through most ancient Egyptian religious and mythological texts, morality seems almost entirely absent. It is not that the ancient Egyptians were immoral or ignored morality. Several morally based tales and lessons were told in ancient Egypt, but the religion itself stressed the importance of ritual over morality. Rituals played such a vital role in ancient Egyptian religion that modern scholars use the term cultic religion when referring to it. The term cult has largely taken on a pejorative meaning in modern society. Still, in this context, it merely refers to religion, where the ritual is paramount, and each of the scores of deities in a particular religion had their own following that performed specific rituals, along with the idea of my art and the emphasis on ritual. The belief in an afterlife was integral to ancient Egyptian religion. All Egyptians hoped to reach the afterlife, also known as the Field of Reeds. But to reach that place, one had to follow the natural order of things and perform the proper religious rituals. In the Egyptian afterlife, religious rituals and mythology came together to create a world that is truly exotic and foreign compared to anything in the modern world. The Egyptians were the first to articulate a belief in the afterlife in writing, and most of their religious and mythological texts concern the afterlife and how to reach it properly. The Egyptians did not view death as an end, but merely as an interruption or transformation, because they believed each person comprised 5 aspects of the self: the Kaaba name, shadow, and the physical body. Among these aspects of the human self, the Egyptians believed that the Ka, a vital spiritual force, could travel between the land of the living and the dead. Scholars know the most about ancient Egyptian mythology via the ritualistic text, often concerned with the afterlife. Unlike the Greeks and Romans, the Egyptians wrote a few narrative myth cycles, so when Egyptologists discuss or study ancient Egyptian mythology, it is difficult, if not impossible, to separate the ritualistic aspects of ancient Egyptian religion from the mythical aspects. The pyramid texts are the oldest texts about ancient Egyptian religion and mythology, making them integral to any study. The pyramid texts are a collection of over 800 spells known as utterances, inscribed inside royal pyramids' burial chambers during the 5th and 6th dynasties, circa 2345 to 2150 BC. The pyramid texts were intended to help the dead king transition from death to the afterlife and ascend to and join the sun god. And though they are not written as myths proper, the utterances relate fragments of myths that concern Osiris, the god of the dead, the divine king, and the sun god Atum-Re, among others. The idea of a divine king is another concept unique to the ancient Egyptians and crucial to their religion and mythology. Unlike their Mesopotamian contemporaries, the Egyptians believed their king was a god and needed the proper religious rituals to maintain Maat, or order throughout the land. Among the many epithets given to the Egyptian king, one of the most popular was the living Horus, which referred to his affiliation with the falcon-headed god of the skies and kingship. Historically speaking, the king's affiliation with Horus can be traced back to at least the early dynastic period, circa 3100 to 2686 BC, and the first part of a king's royal titular, known as the Serek, is often referred to today as the Horus name, because of the image of Horus that is perched atop the Serek. By the 4th dynasty, circa 2575 BC, Horus, central to ancient Egyptian kingship, is most colourfully depicted in one of ancient Egypt's only true narrative myths, the Contendings of Horus and Seth. And though the Egyptian king was associated with Horus while he was alive, the pyramid texts depict his connections to Osiris and autumn. Osiris was the god of the dead and mummification, and before he was killed by his brother Seth, he was also associated with kingship. The Egyptians believed Osiris was vital to the dead king's resurrection, since he protected the dead and attained eternal life through death. The pyramid texts contain numerous utterances where the dead king is associated with Osiris and his afterlife attributes and utterance. 219 is very explicit in the connection between the two. O Atum, this one here is your son Osiris, whom you have caused to be restored so that he may live. If he lives, this king will live. If he does not die, this king will not die. If he is not destroyed, this king will not be destroyed. If he does not mourn, this king will not mourn. If he mourns, this king will mourn the dead kings. Otherworldly prospects were dependent upon his merging with Osiris and subsequent resurrection. And if that did not take place, the Egyptians believed the king could not attain eternal life. The pyramid. Texts give modern scholars a glimpse into the mythological and theological connections between the Egyptian king and Osiris, but the texts also reveal fragments of the mythological origins of mummification, perhaps the two most enduring aspects of ancient Egyptian culture. The pyramids and mummification also were the two most enigmatic, since no known texts exist. That explains how the manufacturing process of either took place. Fortunately, even though no extant instructions about mummification exist, at least not yet, the mythological and theological origins can be more easily traced in ancient Egyptian iconography. Osiris was usually depicted as a mummy with an exposed face, and the pyramid texts provide some of the first textual references to Osiris' connection to the dead king and the mythological and theological importance of mummification and the preservation of the body. Utterance 412 gives particular attention to the latter. O flesh of the king, do not decay, do not rot, do not smell unpleasant. Your foot will be intact, your stride will not be overstridden. You shall not tread on the corruption of Osiris. You shall reach the sky as Orion. Your soul shall be as effective as Sothis. Other utterances that reference mummification include Utterance 423, which states that the dead king shall receive your natron. That may be divine. Natron was the primary mineral the Egyptians used in mummification, which helped dry the skin. Another pyramid text describes the process in a little more graphic detail. Anubis washed my entrails, and Horus's encircling and the Osiris embalming have been carried out in Abydos. Anubis was a jackal-headed god, associated with funerary myths and cults, while Abydos was the cult center and thus the terrestrial abode of Osiris, the pyramid. Texts relate the mythological importance of Osiris and mummification to the ancient Egyptians, but the ultimate goal of the dead king was to ascend to be with the sun god. The concept of the sun god in ancient Egyptian religion and mythology can be difficult to grasp, since he had different personifications and names. Atum, Re and Atum Re are just some names attributed to the sun god in various texts. Nonetheless, the importance of the sun, god and royal Egyptian ideology and mythology can be found in several texts. But as with Horus, a good starting point is in the king's royal titulary. The fifth name in the king's titulary is the son of Re name, because it was preceded by the Egyptian phrase, Sa, son of Re. But as important as the sun god was in the Egyptian pantheon, he played a different role than Horus, because while Horus was associated with the living king, the sun god was associated with creation. After death, the dead king coalesced with the sun god when he successfully ascended, and the mythology behind the importance of the dead king's ascension and merging with the sun. God is related in several utterances from the pyramid texts. One of the most interesting pyramid texts depicts the mythology of the dead. King's Ascension is utterance 548. In this utterance, the dead king navigates a mystical ship to the netherworld, and he is accompanied by the sun god as both Re and Atum and other Egyptian deities. The text reads, "He goes aboard the bark like Re at the banks of the winding waterway. This king rows in the bark of lightning. He navigates therein to the field of lower skies at the south of the field of rushes. His hand is taken by Re. His head is lifted up by Atum, The end of his bow warp is taken by Isis. His stern warp is coiled by Nephthys. The celestial serpent has placed him at her side. Another utterance states that once the king ascended, he became a star in the sky like the sun god. A. The text states, O great, one of the atoms, son of a great one of atoms, the king is a star in the sky among the gods. Tell your mother, O Shiza, that it is the king who weeps for you. It is the king who mourns for you. Give a hand to the king when he comes. O life and my wife, please bring it to the king, which Kanu made so that the king may ascend on it to the sky and escort Re in the sky. Although fragmentary, the pyramid texts guide early Egyptian mythology best, but other funerary texts written in later periods also elucidate ancient Egyptian beliefs and the afterlife, and the gods who they believed dwelled there during the 11th and 12th dynasties of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, circa 2055 through 1795 BC. Many of the utterances of the pyramid texts were expanded and written on the coffins of royals and non-royals alike. Those collections of texts, which numbered over 1,000, are referred to today as the coffin texts, and they functioned in much the same way as the pyramid texts, as they were intended to help the deceased successfully transition into the afterlife. However, these were available to a larger audience because it was during the New Kingdom that the afterlife became accessible to the greatest part of the population, and the underworld and its gods were depicted most graphically, beginning in the Second Intermediate Period, circa 1630 through 1520 BC. The utterances from the pyramid texts and the spells from the coffin texts were collected, expanded, and then written on papyrus scrolls, and became what are known collectively today as the Book of the Dead. The correct translation of the collection is the Book Going Forth by Day, but the title persists because it is shorter and summons images of the exotic and sometimes macabre. Since the spells from the Book of the Dead were written on papyrus rolls, it became more convenient and less expensive, so a larger number of Egyptians could rely on them and thus have access to the afterlife. The Book of the Dead offered several incantations for people journeying to the afterlife, with individual hymns and litanies dedicated to specific deities. For example, one hymn to Ra reads, Hail thou disk, thou lord of rays who rises on the horizon day by day. Shine thou with thy beams of light upon the face of Osiris, and he who is victorious, for he singeth hymns of praise unto thee at dawn, and he maketh thee to set at eventide with words of adoration. May the soul of Osiris, Sunny the triumphant one, come forth with thee into heaven. May he go forth in the Matet boat. May he enter the port in the Sextet boat, and cleave his path among the never-resting stars in the heavens. Regarding mythology, the Book of the Dead provides some of the most graphic depictions of the afterlife, and the gods who judged the dead, and extant copies of the Book of the Dead, such as the Papyrus of Ani, describe the journey to the underworld not only in words but also in art. The Egyptians believed that the text in the Book of the Dead would help the deceased avoid otherworldly traps, while the graphic images depicted what the dead would face. One image and a copy of the Book of the Dead, owned by a scribe named Ani, show the jackal-headed god Anubis weighing the deceased's heart on a scale with the feather of Mart on the opposite scale. If the deceased's heart is heavier than the feather, it is devoured by a monster, and the person suffers permanent death. But if one knows the correct spells, as Ani did, then the deceased can enter the field of reeds. The Book of the Dead opened the afterlife for many Egyptians, and in turn helped to elevate modern understanding of ancient Egyptian mythology. But one final genre of funerary texts must be examined here to better understand the complicated nature of ancient Egyptian mythology. After the Middle Kingdom, the standard method of royal burial changed from pyramids to tombs. So during the New Kingdom, most kings were buried in the Valley of the Kings on the west bank of the Nile River, across from Thebes, modern-day Luxor. In many of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, intricate reliefs were painted on the walls that depicted the sun, God, and the dead king on their nightly journey through the underworld, known in Egyptian as the Duat. These scenes, which vary slightly from tomb to tomb, are known collectively by modern scholars as the Book of Gates, because they depict the sun god's journey through 12 gates or pylons, one for each hour of the night as the sun, God and the dead king travel through the night. They have to contend with various demons and a giant snake known as Apophis. The Egyptians believed this journey was cyclical, as they viewed time itself. So it took place daily. Akhenaten horizon of Aten was the capital of ancient Egypt during the reign of Akhenaten, also known as Amenhotep, the 4th, the 10th ruler of the 18th dynasty of New Kingdom Egypt. And it was custom-built to be his administrative and religious capital. When Amenhotep IV began his reign, he focused on the sun god, particularly Ra-Horakhti. Ra-Horakhti was traditionally represented as a falcon-headed man, but as Amenhotep IV placed greater emphasis on the solar aspects of the god, Ra-Horakhti became known as Aten, he who rejoices on the horizon in his name of light, which is the sun's disk. The sun disk had already become familiar imagery in association with Amenhotep III, so it did not take long for Amenhotep IV to introduce a completely new divine image, and for the image of the falcon-headed man to become the non-anthropomorphic sun disk, with rays of light streaming out from it ending in hands. Thus, Aten replaced Ra-Horakhti, and cults made their final shift from the dominance of the god Amun to that of the god Aten, who was the creator now. After forming the identity of God, Aten and Aten's new place in Egyptian theology as the grand creator, Amenhotep IV, strove to establish the new cult of the Aten in the traditional religious centers of ancient Egypt, including Thebes. He even built a large temple complex to Aten in the main temple precinct of Thebes, but he met with little success as the cult of Amun-Ra was still too strong there. Thus, Amenhotep IV decided to take more drastic measures, including disbanding the priesthoods of all the gods except Aten and rediverting the funds from those cults to that of Aten. On top of that, he created a new religious center, and thus the city of Akhenaten was born. The city was built quickly, allowing the royal court to establish residence there in year 5 of Amenhotep IV's reign. Around this time, he also changed the name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten, which roughly translates to beneficial of the Aten, or servant of the Aten. The Prussian expedition of 1842 through 1845 first explored the city of Akhenaten. It was unique because no such ancient Egyptian town had ever been found. Its unique history and short occupation allowed it to help survive the ravages of time, leaving behind a shell of what once had been. The city had a linear layout, with the more important buildings lying to either side of the royal road, which ran north to south. At the top of this avenue was the North Palace, where the royal family resided, and along the road was the great temple of Aten. The South Palace, an administration centre, was at the southern end of the avenue. The town would have been somewhat unusual with only one religious cult, instead of at least a few other small temples or shrines to other gods. The class structure would also be out of proportion, with the whole royal court administrators and skilled artisans making up a large portion of the population. While Amarna was undoubtedly the new religious centre of Egypt, it needs to be clarified what its administrative duties were. Memphis had long since been the administrative capital of ancient Egypt, and while one of Akhenaten's viziers was stationed at Amarna, the other remained in Memphis, which implies that Memphis was still functioning as an administrative centre during the same period. The reigns of the 26th dynasty kings offer a possible parallel. They set up their capital in Sahur, but Memphis remained an administrative centre. Memphis lost its position as such when the advent of Alexander the Great and his creation of the city of Alexandria, which soon became the religious, cultural and political centre of the country. So while administrative duties were seen too, at Akhenaten, the administration of the whole of Egypt was still being overseen from Memphis. The royal family was always a central feature of art in Amarna, and one of ancient Egypt's most highly acclaimed pieces of art, the dauntingly beautiful bust of Nefertiti, came from the city. The art clearly demonstrates the revolutionary changes that occurred during the period. No longer is the king depicted as being strong, lithe and powerful. Instead, the rulers are depicted with a long, drooping face, a rounded, swollen belly, and curved thighs. Features that are more akin to the female form and representations of fertility than that of an Egyptian king. These changes are thought to represent the androgynous aspect of the Aten, to show him as a cosmic creator and the fertile giver of life. containing within himself both the male and the female aspects of divinity. A further representation of this aspect of God may be seen in the importance placed upon depictions of the whole royal family. King, queen and princess alike. Although not unheard of, it was uncommon for royal children to be depicted alongside their parents in official representations, but many such images are found at Amarna. Akhenaten's reign lasted for 24 years, from 1352 to 1336 BC. But the transition of power from Akhenaten to Tutankhamun is full of controversy. It is believed that Tutankhamun ascended to the Egyptian throne in 1336 BC, sometime after Akhenaten's death. At that time his royal name was Tutankhaten, not Tutankhamun. He would have only been a child of around 9 when he became Egypt's ruler, but for some reason he had no female relative acting as regent. Instead, that job went to a strong man named Horemheb, who was all too eager to do away with Akhenaten's religious changes. Within the first year of his reign, Tutankhamun's name was changed from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, which means ruler of southern Heliopolis. This was a direct and pointed reference to Karnak and the cult of the sun god, Amun-Ra. Tutankhamun's name was not the only thing that changed, because the royal court quickly abandoned Akhenaten and moved to Memphis. Although the city continued to be occupied for a time, it quickly fell into disuse and ruin, which made clear Horemheb was quickly seeking to re-establish the old ways. In fact, Tutankhamun's short reign is often referred to as the Restoration, an apt name given the way Egyptian religion reverted to the old ways. The ancient Egyptian concepts and myths regarding life after death were quite unique. But the Egyptians did share one aspect of mythology with all other human cultures. Like other ancient civilizations and many current ones, the Egyptians believed in divine creation and had 3 different creation myths. Interestingly, ancient Egyptians found it perfectly logical to believe all or parts of the different cosmogonies simultaneously. Details of the ancient Egyptian creation myths are gleaned from fragments of the pyramid texts and other funerary texts discussed above. But it was only during the Greco-Roman period, when the foreign rulers of Egypt were more familiar with narrative myths, that creation accounts transferred into narratives. The 3 major ancient Egyptian creation myths were associated with Heliopolis, Hermopolis, and Memphis, and since the Heliopolitan creation myth is considered the oldest of the 3, it exercised a greater influence over Egyptian religion throughout the history of pharaonic culture. The Heliopolitan cosmogony is also what most people today would traditionally think of as a creation myth. Among the 3, according to the myth, the sun god Atum rose from primordial waters, and then created the first divine pair, Shu and Tefnut, through masturbation. Utterance 527 of the pyramid texts describe the process. Atum is he who once came into being and masturbated in on. He grasped his phallus so that he might create orgasm utilizing it, and so were the twins, Shu and Tefnut. May they put the king between them, set the king among the gods, and form the field of offerings, the primordial mound that Atum sat on when he performed. The creative act is what some scholars believe the pyramids are meant to symbolize, and after the birth of the first divine pair, Shu and Tefnut, in turn, produced Geb and Nut, who then gave birth to Osiris and his sister wife Isis, as well as Seth and his sister, wife Nephthys. Initially, Osiris was the god of kingship until his brother Seth killed him, and the myth of Osiris is the closest thing ancient Egyptians had to what could be considered a myth. Cycle. Osiris was a popular god among all classes of Egyptians for millennia, and he syncretically merged with other gods, such as the APIs, to expand his function beyond just the god of the dead. The popularity of Osiris continued into the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, and led the historian Plutarch to write his own narrative version of the Osiris myth. Perhaps the very basic nature of the Osirian myth, brother killing brother, is why it resonated for so long throughout history. But regardless, the earliest written example of the myth comes from the pyramid texts. The utterance reads, "The Deified pillar of the day. Bark is released for its lord, and the Deified pillar of the day bark is released for its protector. Isis and Nephthys come from the west and one from the east. One has a screeching falcon, one of them has a kite. They have found Osiris, his brother Seth, having laid him low in Negit. When Osiris said, 'Get away from me,' When his name became Sokar, they prevented you from rotting following this, your name of Anubis. They prevent your purification from dripping to the ground, following your name of Jackal of Upper Egypt. They prevent the smell of your corpse from becoming foul following this, your name of Horus of Haiti. They prevent Horus of the East from putrefying. They prevent Horus, Lord of Patricians, from putrefying. They prevent Horus of the Netherworld from putrefying. They prevent Horus, Lord of the Two Lands, from putrefying. And Seth will never be free from carrying you. O Osiris, wake up for Horus. Stand up against Seth. Raise yourself for Osiris, the firstborn son of Geb, at whom the two naiads tremble. The herdsman waits on you. The festival of the new moon is celebrated for you so that you may appear at the monthly festival. Fare southward to the lake and cross over the sea. For you are he who stands untiring amid Abydos. Be a spirit on the horizon. Belong enduring in Mendes. Your hand is taken by the soul of on your hand is grasped by Re. Your head is raised by too many ads, and they have set to you. At the head of the conclave of the souls of on live, O Osiris, live and raise yourself. The utterance may need to be clarified with ancient Egyptian religion or language, especially since Egyptian myths weren't meant for popular or foreign consumption, but it is fairly straightforward. According to the myth, Seth murdered Osiris and threw his corpse into a lake, which was then revived and resurrected through the magical skills of Isis. The Heliopolitan creation myth may have been the most important cosmogony in ancient Egypt, as it clearly articulated the creation process and gave way to the popular Osirian mythic cycle. But the other two cosmogonies were also important in their time and place. The Hermopolis in the creation myth is named for the southern Egyptian city where it originated, Khemnu, in ancient Egyptian, and though it shares some similarities with the Heliopolitan cosmogony, it has a few fundamental differences. The Hermopolis tradition states that creation began in the primeval waters, like in the Heliopolitan myth, but 4 pairs of gods known as the Ogdoad were created. The 4 pairs are mentioned in various texts, such as spell 76 of the coffin texts. There were also variations of the Hermopolitan myth. In one version, the world emerged from a cosmic egg. In other versions, it was either a lotus or a scarab beetle that gave birth to life. The agent behind the creation in the Hermopolis myth is nebulous, because the creator is less important than the creation itself, and the order that the Ogdoad imposes on the world. Although the Ogdoad setup meant that no one god was theologically superior, Amun eventually rose to prominence in theologies associated with the Hermopolis cosmogony. During the Middle Kingdom, and especially the New Kingdoms, the priests of Amun elevated their deity to a level of primacy, not only in the Hermopolis cosmogony, but throughout Egypt, as they combined him with the sun god Ra. After the first kings of the 18th dynasty drove the foreign Hyksos people from the Nile Delta and re-established Egyptian rule over the entire Nile Valley, Amun became the supreme god of the land, and his primary temple of Karnak in Thebes was lavishly embellished and added to by the kings of the 18th through 20th dynasties. There were 4 kings named Amenhotep. Amun and the famous Tutankhamun are at peace in the 18th dynasty, the living image of Amun. Amun took on a warrior persona during the imperialistic New Kingdom as the warrior pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasties waged war in Nubia and the Levant to enrich the Karnak temple. Even after the New Kingdom, Amun, Thebes, and the Karnak temple continued to play an important role in Egyptian culture and government as the high priestesses of the religious institution known as the god's wife of Amun were recognized by new dynasties for their power and influence. The third ancient Egyptian creation myth must be considered a much later origin than the Heliopolitan and Hermopolis cosmogonies. The Memphite cosmogony is named for the city of Memphis, where it originated, but scholars know the least about this myth because only one badly preserved text is known to exist. That articulates the details. The sole text is known as the Shabaka stone for the 8th century Nubian king, which some scholars say also places the myth later. And the Memphite tradition is the least mythological of the 3 creation cosmogonies, and instead presents a theological statement of the god Ptah's relationship to the other gods in the Memphite cosmogony. The Ptah began the creative process not by physical action, but by thinking and saying it. To many, this Egyptian creation myth is like the Abrahamic tradition, since Ptah, like Yahweh, conceives in his heart and creates with his tongue. As important as the creation myths were to the ancient Egyptians, theologically, they were not narrative myths for the most part. But as Egyptian culture became more literate, some narrative myths were written down. The myth of Osiris continued to be important and enticed the imagination of Egyptians, until parts of it finally began to be written in narrative form during the New Kingdom. The Contendings of Horus and Seth became the most popular myth of the Osirian cycle. But how much of it was religious in nature remains a question. The text clearly draws upon both oral and written accounts, but its use in theological functions is doubtful, even though it may have been part of a trend towards popular religion that began in the New Kingdom and culminated in the late period. Whatever the contending theological significance, it relates to important motifs in ancient Egyptian culture. The unity of Upper and Lower Egypt, and the importance of order from a literary perspective. The text is incredibly entertaining and often depicts the deities, especially Seth, with many flaws. The text begins after the murder of Osiris, when Horus brings suit against Seth to gain his father's former position as king. Seth and his backers argue that he should be the king because he is physically stronger than his nephew, while Horus and his supporters respond that the kingship should pass to him because that is the natural progression, the story states. Then Seth, the son of Nut, spoke, "Let him be sent outside with me, and I shall let you see my hand prevailing over his hand in the presence of the Naiad, since one knows no other means of dispossessing him." Then Thoth said to him, "Do we not know what is there? Then pray." Hirokichi became exceedingly angry, for it was praised, and wished to give the office to Seth great strength. The son of Nut and Onerus uttered a loud cry before the Naiad, saying, "What shall we do?" Then said Atum, the great prince of a summoned Ben, the great living god, that he may judge between the two youths. This section demonstrates that the Contendings were clearly influenced by the Heliopolitan cosmogony. Since the Aeneid, the term used for the original 9 gods and Atum has had prominent roles. After little is settled in the courtroom, the Contendings becomes a physical competition where violence and magic are the order of the day. When the Aeneid awards Horus the white crown of Upper Egypt, Seth becomes enraged, appeals to the ruling and challenges Horus to a series of physical competitions during these competitions, which sometimes take a farcical and comedic turn. Seth is repeatedly plagued by his apparent lack of intelligence and Isis, Horus, Mother, and the goddess of magic. The first challenge involves the 2 gods transforming into hippopotamuses and swimming in the sea. The text reads, "Seth said to Horus, 'Come, let us change ourselves into 2 hippopotamuses and plunge into the depth amid the sea. And he who emerges in 3 months shall not receive the office.' So they plunged together. Then Isis sat down weeping and said, 'Seth will kill Horus, my son.' She took a quantity of yarn and made a rope. She took a deben of copper and cast it into a harpoon. She tied the rope to it and threw it into the water at the spot where Horus and Seth had plunged. Then the weapon bit into her son's body. Horus and Horus cried aloud, saying, 'Come to me. Mother Isis, my mother, tell your weapon to let go of me. I am Horus, son of Isis.' Then Isis cried out aloud and said to her weapon, 'Let go of him. He is Horus, my son, and the weapon. Let go of him.' Then she threw it again into the water, and it bit into the body of Seth. And Seth cried aloud, saying, 'What have I done to you, my sister? Isis, call your weapon to let go of me. I am your maternal brother, Oasis.' Then she felt very sorry for him, and Seth called to her, saying, 'Do you love the stranger more than your maternal brother Seth?' Then Isis called to her weapon, saying, 'Let go of him. It is the maternal brother of Isis whom you are biting, and the weapon let go of him.' As a result, the first round of the physical competition between Horus and Seth ended in a stalemate, despite each having their own advantage. Seth was the Egyptian god of violence and chaos, and was sometimes depicted as a hippopotamus, while Horus had the advantage of Isis magic, but neither was able to gain the upper hand, so the competition continued. After the diving competition, Horus became angry with Isis and fled to the desert, and at this point, the myth reveals the character flaws of both participants. Horus is impetuous, feels entitled, and is sometimes naive, while Seth is prone to violence and lacks impulse control. More symbolism abounds as Horus soon learns that the desert is the domain of Seth. Generally speaking, the ancient Egyptians saw the desert as a bad place, and they referred to it as the Red Land, as opposed to the life-sustaining Nile Valley and Delta, which they called the Black Land due to its rich alluvial soil. One of Seth's epithets was the Red One, which referred to the desert. Horus eventually reaches an oasis, but the Lord of the Desert is just a little behind. As for Horus, he was lying under a Chinooka tree in the oasis country. Then Seth found him, seized him, and threw him on his back on the mountain. He removed his 2 eyes from their places and buried them on the mountain. And Seth came and told Prakriti falsely, "I did not find Horus, although he had found him." Then Hathor, mistress of the southern sycamore, found Horus as he lay weeping in the desert. Thereupon she caught a gazelle, milked it, and said to Horus, "Open your eyes that I may put this milk in." He opened his eyes. She looked at them. She found them healed. Then she went to tell Prakriti, "I found Horus deprived of his eyes by Seth, but I restored him." Once again Seth's plans were foiled by outside interference and magic, and the eyes of Horus had particular significance in ancient Egyptian myth, well before the contendings of Horus and Seth. For instance, utterance 201 of the pyramid text states, "O my father, the king, take the eye of Horus, the pat cake of the gods, for they feed an overwhelming majority of the first 200 utterances of the pyramid texts concerning eyes, particularly Horus, as offerings from the dead king to the gods." The ancient Egyptians also believed that the eye of the goddess Wadjet contained special powers, and that the eye of Ra was a powerful entity separate from God himself. After Horus's eyes were restored, the competition continued and ended with a boat race where Seth's stupidity was on full display. After Seth's ploy to blind Horus failed, he attempted to humiliate his nephew in the eyes of the Aad by raping him. But Isis foiled his plan again, and the gods decided to award Horus the kingship. Seth protested yet again and challenged Horus to a boat race, but this time he was foiled by the cleverness of his nephew. The text reads, "Seth took a great oath by the gods, saying he shall only be given the office once he has been dismissed with me, and we shall build ships of stone and race each other. He who wins over his rival shall be given the office of ruler." Then Horus built himself a ship of pine, plastered it over with gypsum, and he launched it on the water in the evening, while no one in the whole land saw it. And Seth looked at the ship of Horus and thought it was of stone. He went to the mountain, cut off a mountain peak, and built himself a ship of stone of 138 cubits. Then they went into their ships in the presence of the Naiad. Thereupon the ship of Seth sank in the water. Seth changed himself into a hippopotamus and wrecked the ship of Horus. Then Horus seized this weapon and hit the body of Seth. Then the Spaniard said to him, "Do not hit him." Frustrated with the situation, Horus travels to the delta and complains to the goddess Neith that he is tired of the proceedings, as they have gone on for 80 years, and he continually beats Seth. The Naiad then decided that Osiris should be contacted for his opinion, so they had Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and scribes, write a letter to the god of the underworld. Osiris chides the Naiad for defrauding his son of this title, and says they should remember that he gives them sustenance. After Osiris receives what he perceives as a rude response to his letter, he lets the Naiad know how powerful he is. "Very good is all you have done, and what the Naiad has found to do. My art has been made to sink into the netherworld. Now you pay attention to this matter. My land is full of savage-looking messengers who fear no god or goddess. If I send them out, they will bring me the heart of every evildoer and be here with me. What good is my resting in the west while you are outside? Who among you is mightier than I? But they have invented wrongdoing. When Peter the Great south of his wall, Lord of Memphis, created the sky, did he not say to the stars in it, 'You shall go to rest in the west every night in the place where King Osiris is, and after the gods, all humanity shall also rest where you are?' So he said to me, this passage is theologically important for a couple of different reasons. First, the importance and power of Osiris are demonstrated quite graphically, and though he is confined to the underworld, he can send his demon minions to wreak havoc on both gods and men. Moreover, the passage combines elements of both the Heliopolitan and Memphite creation myths. The Naiad Heliopolitan is the group being addressed, but he mentions Pata as the creator of the Memphite of the universe. This is a perfect example of the ability of the ancient Egyptians to combine different creation myths, as both Atum and Pata are recognized as creator gods, under threat of being invaded by an army of demons from the underworld. The gods finally relented and gave Horus the kingship. But what happened to Seth in the final act of the Contendings of Horus and Seth? The two are brought before the gods, Seth and Feathers, to receive their rewards. The text reads, "They brought Horus, the son of Isis. They placed a white crown on his head. They placed him on his father's seat, Osiris, and said, 'You are the good king of Egypt. You are the good lord of all land forever and ever.' Then Isis loudly shouted to her son Horus, saying, 'You are the good king. My heart rejoices that you will brighten the earth with your luster.' Then, said Peter the Great south of his wall, 'Memphis, what shall we do for Seth now that Horus has been placed in his father's seat?' 'Then pray,' Hiroshi said, 'let Seth, son of Nut, be given to me, to dwell with me and be my son, and he shall thunder in the sky and be feared.' The most interesting part of the conclusion is Seth's fate. Despite all his faults, he is still rewarded with the valuable job of protecting the sun god from the Apophis snake on his nightly trip through the Duat. Although the value of Seth's place in the ancient Egyptian pantheon may seem dubious to the modern mind, he played a vital role in myth, theology, and even history to a certain extent. Despite being the antagonist in the Osirian myths, the Egyptians never viewed him as evil, because even if Seth represented chaos and disorder to a certain extent, there is no order or Ma'at without chaos or Isfet hiding around the corner. In fact, there are numerous positive depictions of Seth in Egyptian art, such as statues that depict him and Horus crowning the king, or Seth teaching the king archery. Seth was even venerated at certain times throughout ancient Egyptian history, particularly during the 19th and 20th dynasties of the New Kingdom. There were two kings named Seti, man of Seth, during the 19th dynasty, and a king named Seth, knocked strength of Seth, during the 20th dynasty. Seth was one of the most complicated gods in ancient Egyptian mythology, but he transcended modern notions of evil and played an important role in ancient Egyptian culture. The Contendings of Horus and Seth articulate many important ideas from ancient Egyptian mythology, theology and culture, such as kingship and the importance of order. But another important narrative myth details how the gods and goddesses could be frustrated by and still love humanity simultaneously. The destruction of humanity was another narrative myth that became popular during the New Kingdom, although it was first composed during the Middle Kingdom in the classical form of the ancient Egyptian language known as Middle Egyptian. The destruction, like the Contendings of Horus and Seth, relates many ancient Egyptian theological and mythological motifs and concepts in an interesting narrative form. But the destruction has become more important in funerary rituals than the Contendings. The text from the destruction of humanity was inscribed on the walls of some royal tombs in the New Kingdom, which makes it unique because it served both funerary and entertainment purposes. The destruction differs from the Contendings in its tone as well. In the Contendings, the gods are depicted as flawed to a sometimes comical degree, especially Seth, but the deities in the destruction are angry and wrathful. The destruction of humanity begins when the sun god learns that humanity is plotting against him. So he summons some of the other gods to deal with the situation. The sun god has grown old, and the humans tried to exploit the situation. The text states, "It happened in the time of the majesty of Re, the self created after he had become king of men and gods together. Humanity plotted against him while his majesty had grown old, his bones being silver, his flesh gold hair, true lapis lazuli. When his majesty perceived the plotting of humanity against him, his majesty said to his followers, 'Summon to me my eye and Shu, Tefnut Gebnut, and the fathers and mother who were with me when I was in Nun, and the god Nun, and he shall bring his courtiers with him, but bring them stealthily, lest humanity sees, lest they lose heart.'" The narrative begins with many important theological motifs, the first being the prominence of the Heliopolitan cosmogony. Re, associated with Atum, is God's primary creator, and the first two divine couples of the Naiad are the ones he first approaches when humanity rebels. Nun is the personification of the primordial water that Atum-Re willed himself from, which is why he is referred to as the Father. And his eye is also another important motif in ancient Egyptian mythology. As mentioned, The Eye of Horus played an integral role in many utterances of the pyramid texts, and was a plot device in the Contendings of Horus and Seth. But in the destruction, the Eye of Re plays an even more important function. In fact, the ancient Egyptians believed the Eye of Re was an entirely distinct deity from the sun god himself. It was the violent, lioness-headed goddess Sekhmet. Re is initially hesitant to use the power of his AI against humanity, but no one convinces him that he must slay all the humans to retain his position. At that point, the humans developed a guilty conscience over plotting, or deduced that they could not hope to defeat the sun god. So they fled to the desert. The text reads, "Said the majesty of Re, look, they are fleeing to the desert, their hearts fearful that I might speak to them. The vineyard told his majesty, let your eye go and smite them for you. Though schemers of evil, no eye is more able to smite them for you. May it go down as Hathor." The goddess returned after slaying humanity in the desert, and the majesty of this god said, "Well, come in peace, Hathor." "I who did what I came for," said the goddess, "as you live for me, I have overpowered humanity." "And it was balm to my heart," said the majesty of Re. "I shall have power over them as king, by diminishing them." Thus the powerful one, Sekhmet, came into being. This passage is a demonstration of God's power over humanity. Although the humans may have plotted against the aging sun god, they could not hide from their punishment for their insolence, even in the desert abode of Seth. After all, Seth may have been the god of the desert and chaos, but he was still the sun, God's protector. As the two sailed their mystical boat through the Duat every night, the eye's power and personality are also revealed in this passage when Re first sends his eye down to earth. It is in the form of Hathor, the bovine goddess of motherhood. But once she begins massacring the humans, she becomes a powerful lioness, Sekhmet. As the massacre reached its apex, the myth turned, and the sun, God's cleverness and mercy were revealed as the sun god watched Sekhmet efficiently kill the remnants of humanity. He began to feel guilty, but apparently the lioness's power was too much to contend with, so he had to relegate himself to more clever tactics. Sekhmet acquired a taste for human blood, so the sun god fooled her by having his servants mix red ochre with beer and then leave it for the goddess to drink. The text states, "Now when the day dawned on which the goddess would slay humanity in their time of travelling south, the majesty of Re said, 'It is good. I shall save humanity by it.' And Re said, 'Carry it to where she plans to slay humankind.' The majesty of King Re rose early before dawn to have this sleeping drought poured out. Then the fields were flooded, 3 palms high, with the liquid by the might of the majesty of this god. When the goddess came in the morning, she found them flooded, and her gaze was pleased by it. She drank, and it pleased her heart. She returned drunk without having perceived humankind. The majesty of Re said to the goddess, 'Welcome in peace, O gracious one.' This beautiful woman came into being in the town of Emu. Thus God's love for humanity is exhibited, the order is reinforced again, and the vengeful, violent segment is transformed into the benign domestic cat, Bastet, associated with pregnant women and the home. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of this myth is how Sekhmet was tamed through a ploy that involved red-coloured alcohol, which blurred the lines between cult theology and mythology in ancient Egypt. Since the wine was used in the cult ritual of female deities to assuage their wrath, the Contendings of Horus and Seth and the destruction of humankind are the 2 best examples of narrative myths from the New Kingdom that demonstrate several aspects and motifs inherent in ancient Egyptian theology and mythology. But myth writing did not end in Egypt when the glories of the New Kingdom ended. The chronological periods in ancient Egyptian history after the New Kingdom consists of an interregnum known as the Third Intermediate Period, circa 1075 through 728 BC, and the late period 728 BC through AD 395. But they remain enigmatic to many scholars because they were periods when Egypt was ruled by wave after wave of foreigners, including the Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks and Romans. However, it was also the period when great strides forward were made in art and architecture, and those were not the only facets of Egyptian culture to change during the late period, as religious practices and myths also changed significantly during this period. Some scholars have argued that Egypt's opening to the outside world during this period, albeit forced, led to such changes that Egypt was very different from when the Great Pyramids were built. One of the more interesting aspects of religion in the late period was the veneration of humans other than the king. Although this never became common, Egyptians began to venerate and worship certain esteemed individuals as early as the Old Kingdom, circa 2575 through 2150 BC. But it was in the late period when the practice became much more pronounced and popular. Among the more popular of these non-royal cults was that of Imhotep, a third dynasty circa 2667 through 2648 BC, scientist and architect. The 3rd century BC Egyptian historian Manetho credits Imhotep, under his Greek name Emathias, as a great doctor and the first man to build in stone. And modern scholars attribute Imhotep as the architect of King Djoser's famous step pyramid, which was the predecessor to all later true pyramids. Because of Imhotep's accolades, he was revered during his own life, but his worship became fairly common and popular throughout Egypt 1,000 years later. The Greeks in Egypt also venerated Imhotep and identified him with their own god of medicine, Asclepius, which led to his cult center in Saqqara, where the step pyramid is located, becoming a popular pilgrimage site for the sick. Eventually, hymns to the deified Imhotep were inscribed on the walls of temples throughout Egypt. One of the more interesting hymns to Imhotep can be found in the temple within the Karnak temple at Thebes. Although the hymn is dated to the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius at 14 through 37, it invokes traditional pharaonic theological and mythological motifs and deities. The first part of the hymn reads, "Hail to your kind-hearted God, Imhotep son of Ptah. Come to your house, your temple in Thebes. May its people see you with joy. Receive what is present there. Inhale the incense. Refresh your body with libation. This, your seat is your favorite seat, more splendid for you than the seats of other towns. You see a moon in the season's feast, for your seat is next to his. You join life in the joiner of life. It faces your house in Manu. Your arm is sustained by Montu, lord of Thebes. The aim is more ritualistic than mythological text, but there are important elements of myth mentioned. Bata, the creator god in the Memphite cosmogony, is mentioned since the wall the hymn was inscribed on was part of that god's section in the Karnak temple, but the temple itself, and essentially the entire city of ancient Thebes, was the domain of Amun because of the locale. The hymn then gives a place of pride to Amun and Montu, a falcon-headed war god associated with Thebes. The hymn to Imhotep is a shorter hymn to another deified non-royal named Amenhotep, son of Hapu Amenhotep, son of Hapu. Circa 1432-1350 BC, was a new kingdom scribe who lived during the 18th dynasty, primarily during the reign of Amenhotep, the third circa 1390 through 1352. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, rose to the rank of a royal architect like Imhotep over 1,000 years before him, and he oversaw many construction projects that led to his posthumous deification. In fact, the section of the inscription that mentions him gives praise to the scholarly attributes of both deified architects. The learned ones praise God for you, foremost among them your brother who loves you, whom you love. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, he abides with you. Your bodies form a single one. Your bars receive the things you love brought to you by your son, Caesar Augustus. Two important things stand out from this section of the hymn. First, both Imhotep and Amenhotep, son of Hapu, are believed to be of one body and bore, which may seem strange to modern sensibilities, but not to the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians practiced religious and mythological syncretism, combining two or more different gods or god aspects to create new gods such as Re-Atum or Amun-Re, or even a mixture of cosmogonies. Thus, the deification of Amenhotep, son of Hapu and Imhotep, meant they could be syncretically combined, as was done with this hymn. Furthermore, both Imhotep and Amenhotep, son of Hapu, were the object of veneration by scholars in this hymn, which places them in a similar role to saints in modern Christian churches. The hymn to Imhotep provides an interesting look into a unique aspect of late-period theology and mythology, but two final examples of late-period myths are also crucial. The most enduring and popular myths in ancient Egyptian history were from the Assyrian cycle, but the Assyrian myth cycle did not end with the New Kingdom, and the Egyptians continued to add their own interpretations, even after the Greeks ruled Egypt under the Ptolemaic dynasty. 332 through 31 BC, one important late-period Assyrian text, the Lamentations of Isis and Nephthys, was written as an addendum to the Book of the Dead. The texts were originally written in the hieratic script on papyrus scrolls as part of the Assyrian mysteries performed in temples, and later in a funerary context as part of the Book of the Dead for deceased individuals. The text references the Assyrian myths as Isis, Osiris's sister, and Nephthys, Osiris's sister and Seth's sister's wife, and the deities who praise the dead Osiris. Part of the Isis dialogue reads, "I say she speaks. She says, O you, Avon, you rise for us daily in heaven. We cease not to see your rays forth. Your guard raises your bar in the day. Bark in this your name of the moon. I have come to see your beauty in the Horus. In your name of Lord of the 6th-day feast, your courtiers beside you shall not leave you. You conquered heaven by your majesty's might. In this your name of Lord of the 15th-day feast. You rise for us like Re. You shine for us daily as our tomb gods, and men live by your sight. As you rise for us, you light the two lands. Light land is filled with your presence. Gods and men look to you. No evil befalls them. When you shine as you cross the sky, your foes are not. I am your guard. Every day you come to us as children in the moon and sun. We cease not to behold you. Your sacred image. Orion in heaven rises and sets every day. I am Sothis who follows him. I will not depart from him. This passage is important because it presents Osiris as a cosmic god associated with the constellation Orion and the dog star Sothis Sirius. Although Osiris acted primarily as an underworld deity with sonic traits, as Egyptian history progressed, he merged with cosmic and solar deities to attain some of those attributes. The Lamentations of Isis and Nephthys also reference other naiad Heliopolitan deities such as Atum and Horus. The Eye of Horus is mentioned in this text once more as an important theological and mythological aspect of the Osirian mysteries and cycle. But interestingly, Seth needs to be more credible in the absence of this text. Perhaps the original author of the text thought it out of place to mention the killer of the god who the Lamentations were for. But a more reasonable explanation may be found from the period when the text was composed, as mentioned above. By the late period, the god Seth was transformed from a somewhat odious but necessary part of the Egyptian pantheon to a truly evil god. Seth fell out of favor in the late period, and any mention of God, even in a negative context, became extremely rare. One final group of stories to consider is known collectively as the stories of Set and Campus. Two stories were written on papyrus in the later Egyptian dialect and form of writing known as Demotic. These stories, dated to the Ptolemaic dynasty, revolve around the mythical adventures of a historical person named Kamwas, one of the many sons of the long-lived 19th dynasty, King Ramesses II, circa 1279 through 1213 BC. Although not deified by later generations like Imhotep, Kamwas became known in his own and later periods for restoring Old Kingdom monuments and his knowledge of religion and magic, as he was a high priest of Ptah. In the first story, Setny Kamwaset, Prince Kamoy seeks a book of magic written by the god Thoth. He learns that the book was acquired by a magic-using prince named, many generations before, but the book ultimately cost that prince his life. Setny eventually acquired the book of magic, but was forced to return it to Nani for Koptos' tomb, when he finds out that the secrets of the gods are not meant for mortal men. The second story of Setnica USA also involves magic, but the titular character must use his skills to navigate through the underworld. The underworld of this myth is one in which the Egyptian and Greek concepts of the afterlife are combined as the just are rewarded and the evil is punished. Setnica Mwes also travels through the land of Nubia, which is full of magic users, even more powerful than himself. Ultimately, the Setnica stories occupy a unique place in ancient Egyptian religion and myth. The stories are full of theological and mythological motifs, but the Greek influence is apparent, especially in the second story, which details rewards and punishments in the afterlife. In ancient Egyptian religion, one passed through successfully to the field of reeds by knowing the correct spells and not necessarily being moral, and there was no place for eternal punishment in Egyptian theology or mythology. to the ancient Egyptians, at least those of the New Kingdom, and earlier such concepts would have seemed foreign, but by the late period, Egyptian religion had changed and in some ways become a hybrid. That was probably the natural course for ancient Egyptian religion and mythology. A religion commonly combines different deities, mythologies, and even cosmogonies. So it was natural, or at least inevitable, to incorporate other people's mythologies.